Great. Hi, everyone. So my name's Nigel. I'm going to give a quick talk on spirituality and psychology, generally Western psychology and spirituality and the relationship between the two, and really how they can help each other and support each other and potentially be used in tandem, and how that relates to Kundalini. And hopefully this will be some good stimulus for us to talk about this and our own experiences in Kundalini and yeah, what everyone thinks really. So I've had a go at thinking about the definition of these two things. Oh, Samir wants to join, so I'm just admitting him. And for some reason, my presentation isn't moving forward. Oh. There we go. So I'm sure you'll be able to help me do a better definition of these two things, but in essence, psychology is the study and analysis of human behavior, emotions, and mental processes. And spirituality, struggled to find one definition of this because there's so many. So I put a few things together and wrote an experience and or belief of a being bigger than the self, beyond the material world, something about the interconnectedness of all things. So something in that ballpark. So with psychology, we're looking at human personality, our psyche, psychological models, to some extent biology, neuroscience can come in, personality types and typologies. We're looking at the use of research and data and evidence, and to a large extent, categorizations and models. You know, people like to create models in psychology to help frame things and understand things, and to a certain extent, put people in categories. And it can become clinical and pathological. You know, you can be diagnosed in the world of psychology to be a specific thing. And, you know, and to some extent that sort of rubs against the more spiritual outlook on the world, where we don't like necessarily to put people in pigeonholes, and we're talking about transformation and change rather than things being static. And spirituality, as you'll all know, I mean, for me, I've written down, it's about an experience, really. And so it's much more personal and harder to define. It is a way of being. It's about being in relationship to something. It's this higher knowledge and understanding. It is in its nature mystical. And it's about knowing. You know, we all talk about knowing things, and when you know, and when you know the truth, then you realize the truth, it is the truth. And this idea of there is an ultimate truth and ultimate truths. So it is more nebulous and harder to define. It's not as cut and dry. And I think psychology can help us understand our kind of small self, and spirituality obviously helps to understand our big self with a capital S. And these two things can coexist and be helpful to one another. So under the understanding the self is looking at things like nature and nurture. You know, what's my DNA, or you know, what's my ancestry that creates who I am, and how's that been? How does that go alongside my experience as a human and the nurture that I've had? Personal consciousness and subconsciousness. It is about our personal being and our personality and our behavior and these personality types in childhood, our family, our childhood experiences. Our inner child is often referred to. And we do come up with definitions and tests for things like ADHD and OCD, and narcissistic personality disorder, autism, etc. There's various different classifications for types of psychology, and they're quite well defined, and tests exist to say you are or you are not, or you're somewhere on the spectrum of these kinds of things. Whereas spirituality is less well defined naturally. It is about this personal experience, a practice, faith, knowledge, knowing, this kind of idea of connecting to an ultimate truth. And ultimately, that is a personal experience. It's something that can only be experienced personally. And it's much harder to put in boxes and kind of define. And in understanding the self, there's a lot of stuff that can help us understand ourselves, small selves, like therapy and group therapy, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, for treating trauma, internal family systems, trauma work, inner child work, attachment theory, I found really useful, and even things like hypnotherapy. So lots and lots of resources and tools and techniques to help us understand ourselves. And in terms of understanding our bigger self, well, I was kind of thinking about this, and I guess, well, it comes down to a practice ultimately, isn't it? It's kind of what we do every day and how we are being, and things like prayer and mantra and contemplation and teaching and texts, service to others, you know, our place in the community, being in tune with nature, connecting to the cosmos. All of these things can help us understand ourselves and feel this richer picture of who we are as a connected self, a bigger self, something beyond ourselves. And I guess these are the kinds of things that we turn to help ourselves do that, and make it a richer experience and a more meaningful and deeper experience. And transpersonal psychology really tries to create a bridge between these two things. It's basically saying, yes, there is this human psychology, which is about our small selves, but there's also something much bigger than that. There is another part of ourselves and ultimately our psychology, which is hugely influenced by and part of this bigger thing that is not just us. It's kind of everything and all things. And transpersonal psychology popped up really because there were people who were psychologists and said, you know, there's a lot more to it than this. It's not just the self. It's not just the individual. There's this whole other thing going on. And that was certainly my personal experience when I did a counseling course that had no spirituality connected to it. We were talking a lot about human psychology. I was going through a Kundalini awakening and thinking, yeah, I get this psychology, but no one's talking about this other thing, which is so important and massive. And why is this not brought into the conversation? And that's what happened with transpersonal psychology, which really sort of lifted off in the 60s, was called the fourth force in psychology. Abraham Maslow, Stanislav Grof and Ken Wilber and people like that came along and said just that. Look, we're psychologists, and you know, generally they were at universities studying psychology and being professors, but they were having their own spiritual experiences, and they were saying there's something much more than this. And they wanted to bring these things together and bring them a bit more into the mainstream, not see them as separate and just study psychology without any connection to this wider world. And for me, really, Jung was the first transpersonal, certainly modern transpersonal psychologist. You know, he came up with the ideas of the collective unconsciousness and archetypes and alchemy. And he said it's not just about the individual person. There is this collective that there's a universal psyche that we all tap into. These archetypes are universal. They're not individual to us. They're individual to kind of everybody, and you know, the whole world has access to some collective unconsciousness. And so he really sort of brought forth these ideas. And I think he was, and that was really the reason he broke away from Freud, who you know, he was his protege, and they sort of famously split. And one of the main reasons was Jung wanted to explore this kind of mystical side of psychology, and Freud was dead against it because he felt it would discredit all the work that he'd been doing, because he wanted the work to be taken seriously in an academic kind of setting. And he felt this kind of mystical side to it would just make them a bit of a laughing stock. So they couldn't agree on that. And good for the world that Jung didn't agree with Freud, because Jung obviously contributed a huge amount to that. So why is this all relevant to Kundalini? Well, Kundalini obviously is many, many, many different things, and I am not the expert. I am the baby, and consider myself quite new to it. And it works on many levels, but I think there's a consensus, certainly that I hear, that one of the things it is doing is cleansing our personal traumas, emotions, and beliefs. And you know, this whole idea of energy working through our systems, cleansing our chakras, and trauma being stored inside our bodies becomes a very real experience, you know, physically, emotionally, psychologically, when you're in a Kundalini kind of experience. So it's purifying these suppressed emotions is kind of the idea. This buried pain that we hold on to could be past experiences from childhood, past lives potentially, and these traumatic memories are kind of stored in our bodies. So processing that and bring it into the light of consciousness is a way that this Kundalini process potentially is healing us. And, there's a case to be said that, the more kind of blockages you've got, the more work that has to be done. And I think Katie Mottram, when she was talking on the podcast with Alan and Samir, was alluding to, one of the two guys, I think, asked Katie, what's the link between trauma and Kundalini experience? And I think she was saying there seems to be some sort of connection. And certainly that's something that she was interested in exploring. So it'd be good to talk about that. And I've heard numerous spiritual, leaders talk, say, do the shadow work. The shadow is introduced by Jung. It's this idea of our wounded self. So it's kind of all the hurt that we haven't fully processed and we've suppressed and pushed down. And the shadow work is about exploring and integrating that unconsciousness and bringing to the surface those repressed emotions and fears and desires, and acknowledging them and understanding them, and in bringing them to the light is ultimately a healing process that we're able to, come to terms with them and make peace with them and bring them into ourselves rather than be kept in the dark. We bring them into who we are, take ownership of them, and in fact can start to actually see them as beneficial rather than something negative, something that we can all learn from. So we've all got a shadow and we've all potentially got lots of benefit from shadow work. So I thought I'd just touch quickly on spiritual bypassing, because there can be a tendency, and I have personally seen this, to use spiritual ideas to sidestep and avoid this shadow, effectively, to avoid facing unresolved emotional issues and psychological wounds and unfinished development tasks. And this was sort of brought into the world by John Wellwood in the 80s, who kind of coined this idea, because he was seeing it as a psychologist and his own spiritual experiences. So it's things like when people say, oh, it's not real, it's just a story, it's just your story, it's all an illusion and everything happens for a reason and it's karma. So rather than leaning into some of these challenges and leaning into our shadow, we say, well, you don't really need to bother because ultimately it's all just, an illusion and it doesn't really matter. So just let it go. And I found this from someone called Melissa Renzi on the internet, which I thought was really nice, actually. She talked about absolute reality and relative reality. Absolute reality being the thing that, the non-dualistic Vedic and Buddhist traditions talk about, which is, there's something that's changeless, eternal and transcendent. It's the absolute truth of oneness, the nature of how things truly are in the universe. And I'm sure lots of us can buy into that. But then there's this relative reality, and that's subject to being time-bound and dependent. It is the observable phenomena of our human and worldly existence, which is dependent on our circumstances, our resources, our relationships, our feelings that we actually experience. And she said that, experience a glimpse of absolute reality does not mean you have to denigrate the relative reality as simply an illusion, and that the absolute is not superior to the relative. Both are true, certainly in our human lives. If we're here, if we are spirits having a human experience, then right now, these realities are both coexisting at the same time. And we don't necessarily need to say, well, this is the truth and this isn't the truth. Ultimately, absolute reality might be the truth, but we are living in a life, in a human body right now. And for my own self, I think it's easy to overestimate your place on the path. If you are Ramana Maharshi or the Buddha or Jesus, then absolute reality is probably where you're at, and that's probably the most relevant thing to you. Or you're some kind of super evolved spiritual master, or fulfilled your Kundalini process, if you want to look at it like that. Your Kundalini process is complete. Maybe relative reality isn't so important. But to me, relative reality is important because my Kundalini process is far complete. There's lots of healing to be done. There's lots of trauma still trapped, and it feels very real and very human and very emotional, and here and now, to me at least. So I've definitely overestimated my place on the path occasionally, and I got a bit carried away, that, you know, I've kind of reached some high level, only to realize not too long after that I haven't actually reached that level. And you get brought down to earth a little bit. And so this non-dualistic dogma, and I don't want to be critical of non-dualistic dogma because I completely buy into it. You know, I love you know, those traditions and absolutely study them myself. But there is a danger that you can bypass psychological healing with those. You know, to say I don't have attachments, I'm not affected, we're going to focus on the positive, we just need to be grateful for everything. Everything is one conscious. Don't be angry. Anger is destructive, you know, a destructive emotion. And the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. You create your own reality. It's just your ego, etc., etc. And on a bad day, deflecting responsibility, where, you know, a spiritual leader could be criticized and deflect it as, well, why is this coming up for you? You've got you've got work to do because you're seeing something negative in somebody else. And all of that can really deny the need, you know, for healthy attachments and relationships, which we do need. We need healthy attachments and relationships. And it can alienate those struggling with grief, you know, trauma, and things, you know, or even systematic injustice, which we experience in our cultures. So if you're not, you know, if you're doing too much of the left, you're potentially avoiding your shadow and you're not bringing some of that suppressed stuff into the light. And I think there's a big danger of that, because that just might make things harder for you, not easier. And I think, you know, and it'd be interesting to see what people think about that in the processes that we're in. And certainly as well, if you look at something like the 5 koshas, you know, our human ego mind has an important role to play in awakening, and psychology and psychological, you know, tools can be helpful for that. You know, our intellectual mind and our thoughts and our emotions are really important part of this psycho-spiritual, emotional, physical, electrical experience that we all have. It's working on many levels, and certainly the human mind has an important role. So seeing and accepting and letting go of fear, to me, seems like a big, important part of the process. So why not lean into tools that can help you let go of fear, rather than try and dismiss fear too quickly? If you're not there yet, that can be quite dangerous. And so where I end up with it is this sort of psychology of the soul, this sort of soul psychology. And it'd be interesting to know what people think. This is the last chart. You know, are we souls living in a human experience? Do we have a soul purpose for this lifetime? Are we here to learn lessons, and what would those lessons be? And how is that relevant to Kundalini? And, you know, how can understanding psychology help us learn those lessons? As well as spiritual practice, can psychological work help us through this experience that we're having?